Hit the record. There he goes. Okay. So this is Dave Winkler and with the Naval Water for our monthly history happenings talk. And I am pleased to have a fellow Nittany Lion, Penn Stater, on board. K.A. Nelson graduated Penn State NROTC many years after I did. And then he went on, served in the Marine Corps. He was Marine option for 5 years. And then he got out and got into diving. I think this is what got him interested in the topic we're having tonight. He resides, I think, in Westchester, Pennsylvania, a wonderful place, part of the world. And I am really looking forward to this. I grew up in New Jersey. I used to go down to the Jersey Shore, Seaside Heights, Seaside Park. And when I was on the beach, my relatives used to talk about World War II and German U-boats off the coast. In fact, I even heard stories about U-boats coming into Barnegat Bay and taking out some targets there. So it's Germans were very aggressive. We were not very bright at the beginning of the war. We kind of had lights on, silhouetting ships. I don't want to steal K.A.'s thunder here, so I'm going to turn over the floor, and he's got some excellent slides for you. So, K.A., welcome aboard.
Great to be here. Dave, thank you for that introduction. And thanks for helping make this opportunity possible. This is always the highlight of my week or month, getting to do something like this, whether it's in person or remote. So thank you, Dave, and thank you everyone else for turning up. I'm going to talk for about 35 minutes, and then we'll cut to question and answers until Dave cuts me off. So without further ado, here we go. So I have two boilerplate presentations that I do, and I choose one or the other depending on the audience. Sometimes I'll make one custom. I have one that's kind of more military focused, and then I have one that's a little bit more, when I speak to the grandma's association down the shore, I can't really be talking about centers of gravity and explosive power. So you guys are going to get a little bit more the military focused one. And really this hinges on three big topics. So I look at, as you can see on the screen, look at this subject of my book from the high level strategic, the tactical, and then sort of a technical look at some of the aspects of U-boats themselves. We're not going to cover all of any of these three topics, but I picked a few kind of subsets of each that I thought were particularly relevant and interesting. So in the interest of time, we'll push. So I'm not going to talk too much about my book here. That's not really, I hope you read it, but that's not why I'm here. I just need to tell you a little bit to give you some of the context of why of this presentation. So it took me 3 years to research and write this. I started it on a whim, and it finally was published by Casemate in April of 2024. So it's out in hardcover and Kindle form, and the audiobook actually comes out in just a few days. That'll be out on the 20th. So it was a big effort, and it was 3 solid years of writing and research to get this out, because I was intent on doing it the right way. It's very easy to kind of half-ass this, and I was very intent from the beginning not to do that. So the book, it tells one story, but it does so in 3 parts. So the first part gives a high-level historical background, talks about the birth of submarine technology, covers the German submarines off the Jersey Shore during World War I. It also introduces Admiral Karl Dönitz and some of the tactics and strategies that I'm gonna review tonight. So what you're sort of getting tonight is sort of a distilled version of chapter 1. Part 2 covers 11 different sinkings that occurred near New Jersey, and interspersed throughout part 2 are more details about, again, the strategy, tactics, engineering behind this subject. And then those 11 sinkings are interwoven with one another. So the Chapter 16, 17 covers the end of the war and then brings it up to the present day, kind of the later lives of some of the characters. And all the characters, I call them that, but they're all real people. So as a whole, this tells one story from start to finish. It's not a collection of topics or a collection of stories. I wanted to put a real narrative spin while still staying completely true to the facts. So that's kind of really the extent of the book itself. And now I want to take you into some of the actual meat of what's being discussed. But first, one of the things that I realized in the course of doing this research is that there really is there's not a wide body of statistics, reliable statistics related to this topic. I noticed that as I poured through every reputable book, like Gannon's, like countless others, I just kept seeing the same numbers over and over, and some of them were suspect, and some of them I could tell came from wartime Navy, reports, which were not. Those were fuzzy numbers at best. So I eventually realized that there's a lot of statistics that I wanted to use in the book that just haven't been calculated. So I decided to do it myself. And I'm never going to do it again because it was extremely painstaking. But over the course of many months, I collated all the data that I needed onto a few different Excel sheets. And one in particular was kind of the one that I started with. And it's a master list of all the sinkings. It started with New Jersey sinkings, and then it became North America, it became United States coast sinkings, and then it became North America. So eventually I'll finish adding all the Canadian and Caribbean ones, and it'll be like a master Western Hemisphere reference. But long story short, the numbers I'm going to show you, I don't think anyone has ever calculated them before. If they have, I have not been able to find it. So this kind of sets the tone for what I'm going to talk about afterward. So within the first 8 months of 1942, which really was almost the entirety of the U-boat campaign in American waters. There was a little bit in 44 and 45, but really we're talking January through August of 42. As a proportion of worldwide losses, the waters within 400 nautical miles of the U.S. accounted for 29% of the merchant ships lost. That's 210 merchantmen. 47% of the merchant ships damaged. That's 44. And 24% of the naval warships lost worldwide. So that's 8 out of 33. And that's comparing U.S. waters out to 400 nautical miles against the rest of the world for this 8-month period. And there's 100 other ways I can splice this, but this is kind of the view and the data set, this particular slide, that I think is most important. But it's not complete, because there's another one. There's obviously a human toll that this entails. So from within that 8-month period, the lives lost from those were 416 U.S. servicemen, 2,688 mariners, that's both Allied and neutral, and then 176 personnel from other Allied countries, mostly British, Norwegian, Canadian, and Dutch. And there's actually another 120 or so civilian passengers that are not represented on this slide. Now, if I were to look at, I have another slide that shows from through the entirety of the war, so or U.S. involvement. So I have another one that goes from January 42 to May of 45. These numbers don't change a lot. I think the merchant count goes up by 100 and change, a few dozen on the military. So really, when we talk about the U-boat campaign in American waters, however we want to define American waters, we're really talking about this period in 1942. So into the first of our 3 topics that I want to cover here. So I'm going to talk about the high-level strategy, specifically the decision-making behind closed doors in Germany and occupied France. And when I talk about decision-making in this context, I'm really referring almost entirely to an individual named Admiral Karl Dönitz. He basically was the U-boat force. He was the driving thought leader behind its strategic and tactical dimensions. There's almost no other naval officer to be discussed when we're talking specifically about the U-Boot-Waffe other than Karl Dönitz. So Dönitz's entire philosophy toward this campaign really can be summarized or it's really captured with three horizontal principles. The first of these is a German term called Handelskrieg. This stems from the First World War. You actually don't hear it very much in the context of the Second, but Handelskrieg is German for trade war. And it originated earlier in the century because that was the first time that this kind of war in this way was perceived as, a distinct type of warfare. And when we talk about trade war, obviously we're not talking about tariffs or import and export policy. We're talking about destroying the enemy's physical means of bringing raw material, and men in or out of his country. In fact, in the latter part of World War I, it was the first half of 1917 that Germany came closer to winning the war with U-boats than they ever would in World War II. By April of 1917, there were 13 or 14 British ships going down a day, or ships en route to or from the British Isles going down per day. It was an absolutely unsustainable loss rate. Of course, April 1917 was also the same month that the United States entered the war. But this idea remained in the consciousness of people that were doing strategic thinking after the war. The notion that if we can destroy a nation's ability to conduct trade or to engage in imports of any sort, we can neutralize their ability to fight on, which of course is correct. The second principle is, this is straight from Donitz's mind himself. The term is called integral tonnage. As far as I know, he came up with that. Tonnage obviously being the operative metric of this subject. When we talk about warships, the tonnage refers to obviously displacement. In this context, it's gross registered tonnage, so it's cargo carrying capacity rather than displacement. But tonnage was, in any event, the driving metric of the entire war at sea, and this would apply also to U.S. subs operating in the Pacific theater. But tonnage was the only metric that Dönitz cared about. How many tons were sunk this month? How many can we sink next month, next year? But what Dönitz kind of changed up about this is that his idea of integral tonnage is that he saw all allied tonnage as basically fungible. He wasn't particularly concerned with ships flying under a certain flag or ships sailing a certain route. In fact, as he wrote in April of 1942, Dönitz says the enemy shipping forms a single totality. In this regard, it's immaterial where a ship is sunk. Once it's been destroyed, it has to be replaced with a new ship, and that's that. What he means is that it doesn't matter if I sink them in the North Sea or in the Mediterranean. Well, Mediterranean's a bad example, but it doesn't matter if it's along the coast of Africa, if it's in the North Sea, if it's in the Indian Ocean. Once a ship is lost, it has to be replaced. So what he did accordingly is, this leads me to the third principle here, which is maybe a term some of you have heard before, Schwerpunkt. So Schwerpunkt is essentially the German analog for center of gravity. And because Dönitz saw tonnage as essentially fungible, and because he was operating under very restrictive resource constraints, what he decided that the way he was going to get the most mileage out of the limited resources at his disposal is that he was going to focus his U-boats wherever they could sink the most tonnage at the least risk to themselves. So consequently, the decisive phase of the Battle of the Atlantic, the first half, really kind of ends up looking like a whack-a-mole game where the U-boats will converge in one spot, sink a ton of ships, and then when that area finally gets locked down, they'll move somewhere else that's also vulnerable. And it's this approach that ultimately brought them to the East Coast of the United States in early 1942. So those three kind of, I like the term horizontal principle, that kind of sums up Dönitz's approach toward the war at sea. He's going to focus on merchant ships. He doesn't really care about warships. He's going to sink as many of them as possible without regard to whose ships they are or where they are. And he's going to go wherever on the globe that he can, that his U-boats can reach, where ships can be most easily targeted. So I think it's pretty well understood, certainly within this group, just the sheer amount of stuff that came out of the United States during World War II. That's heavy hardware. That's things like food, shipbuilding, especially was a one of the. In fact, the arguably the most impressive feat of mass manufacturing in human history was the United States output of Liberty ships, Victory ships, and the T2, T3 tankers between 1942 and 1945. We're talking in the area of 3,700 merchant ships. And that's, of course, in addition to the aircraft carriers and the submarines and the cruisers and the destroyers and the battleships and landing ships and the tanks and the aircraft and everything else. I thought I understood this topic when I went into the research. I still didn't. So there's a few figures that I throw around the book which stick with me. So in terms of shipbuilding, warships, in the entirety of the war, the Japanese built 30 aircraft carriers of all types. That's the fleet carriers and the escort carriers, the light carriers, that's 30. The United States built 151, in addition to all that other stuff. The US built more tanks in 1943 alone than Germany built during the entire war. The US built more aircraft, or built about the same amount of aircraft as all three Axis powers combined. So I thought I understood this stuff, but I didn't. Nor did I understand the scope of support that went to the Soviets before I started this research process. It was so profound that by 1945, at the end of the war, 2/3 of all the big ticket hardware items that the Allies were using globally were products of American factories. That's everything from rifles to jeeps to howitzers to aircraft to landing ships. 2/3 of that came out of the United States. But that's not even all, because at the time the US entered the war in December of 1941, the country was also had 58% of the world's oil refining capacity, and it accounted for 62% of all the oil extraction globally. Moreover, because of combat in the Mediterranean and the inability to use the Suez Canal, by the time the US enters the war and the U-boats arrive a few weeks later, the Western Hemisphere accounts for about 95% of Britain's oil supply. And not to mention, it accounts for the United States' own oil supply, because there was no pipelines at that time. So all of the oil getting used along the East Coast had to be delivered by tanker. But it wasn't even just oil and manufactured goods, because the Western Hemisphere was, as FDR put it in, I think, 1940, he says there's no more tempting loot in the entire round world than what we have here in our hemisphere. So an enormous amount of raw materials came not only from the United States, but from other hemispheric neighbors. I list things from South Africa on this list because all of that had to get shipped through Trinidad. It got shipped across the South Atlantic and then north from there. So for logistical purposes, South Africa is part of the Western Hemisphere in this subject. Copper from Chile, manganese, extremely important, used to, of course, harden steel. Bauxite is necessary to make aluminum. And all of these things, some of them went into US factories as inputs to various industrial processes to make tanks or to produce food. Some of it went directly over to Britain and the Soviet Union as raw material. For the first half of the war, so from the war start up until December of 42, everything leaving the Western Hemisphere is going through Nova Scotia. So they're using two ports there, Sydney and Halifax. So you've got manufactured goods from the United States are being shipped through there. You've got all of these, directly or indirectly, all this material wealth from farther south, all the raw materials, all of this stuff, the oil, the manganese, the jeeps, the rifles, it all has one thing in common. It all has to get shipped up the East Coast. Everything. Like I mentioned with the oil, with the tanker issue, the major industrial centers along the East Coast are entirely reliant on tankers that are bringing oil and refined fuels from the Gulf of Mexico and the Caribbean. If that flow is shut off, then there's no oil on the East Coast. About 90% of the East Coast oil is coming up the seaboard by tanker. At this point, as I said, There's no pipeline. They can't do it by rail, and they can't do it by road. The Eastern Sea Frontier War Diary, which I read till my eyes bled, the ones from 1942 for this book. In June of 1942, there's a phrase in there that I thought was just perfect. The Eastern Seaboard and specifically the shipping lanes along it are described as a single link in the great chain binding together the United States and our allies. And the Germans understood this very well, because it does not take a genius, and Dönitz was a pretty sharp guy, but it doesn't take a genius to look at a map and see the weak link in this chain. Because if the sea lanes along the East Coast can be cut off, the entire Allied global war machine, at least as far as the Atlantic theater goes, stops. So this is, whether it's finished goods, oil, raw materials, it all hinges on being able to move safely through the East Coast. Unfortunately for the world at this point, the East Coast, at the time the U-boats arrive in January of 1942, is essentially undefended. There's almost nothing along the coast. So we covered strategy, high level. We're going to drill down a bit into tactical, because Dönitz he not only had specific ideas, and again, I have to go back to Dönitz, because if you're talking about the U-boat war from the German perspective, you're sitting inside the brain of Karl Dönitz. There's no way around it. And he had some very specific ideas, not only about how his forces would be employed on a strategic level, but also at the tactical level as well. And for the decisive phase of the war, these tactics actually worked pretty well. So the U-boat attacks that occurred near the U.S. coast, most of them, in fact, all of them, featured at least one, if not all three, of the following traits. The first one is that they were usually conducted on the surface. U-boats, like all submarines at this time, are much faster on the surface. They have much better visibility. Their overall survivability at this phase of the war is much better on the surface. And even more important than survivability, their ability to locate and engage targets. They really can't do it underwater unless they've already gotten close. So at this phase of the war, radar is still not particularly widespread. And as I said earlier, the East Coast having basically the front door open, it gave them a lot of latitude to not only operate at will, but to spend most of the time on the surface, which was their tactical preference. They would submerge if it was a daytime attack, which did happen. They submerged more later in 1942 when the conditions started to get a little bit less permissive. But by and large, they would attack on the surface. The other trait that these attacks usually exhibited is that they tended to be from close range. The interwar submarine doctrine in the Anglophone navies, as well as for the Germans, was called for really long range attacks. So like 1.5 miles, 2 miles out, firing a spread of 4 and hoping that your trigonometry was right. Dönitz threw this completely out the window when he took over the U-boat fleet in 1935. His prescribed optimum distance was 600 meters, and attacks even happened as close as 400 meters. This had 2 benefits. The first of which being that it's very hard to dodge a torpedo if it's coming at you from 400 meters away, assuming that you can even see it in time. The other thing is it made it more likely that the torpedoes would hit. As probably everyone in here knows, the farther you are away from a target, doing something like firing a torpedo, it's like shooting an azimuth with a compass. The farther the distance, the greater an error will get magnified over a long distance. So by shooting up close, it ensured that targets usually could not dodge them, and it made it more likely that they would hit. Finally, these attacks during the first half of the war, as well as in U.S. waters, were usually conducted at night. As I mentioned earlier, there were daytime attacks, but if you're operating from close range on the surface, you really need that cover of darkness to get in close and hit it. This picture, I forget offhand what ship that was. I think it was taken from board U-552, but that is an attack along the East Coast. I do talk about the topic of wolf packs in the book because I don't think you can really write a book about the U-boat war and not talk about wolf packs. It's also obviously tangentially relevant. That being said, there were no wolf pack operations along the east coast of the United States. For those that don't know, wolf packs were, the Germans called it Rudel tactic or pack tactic. The phrase wolf pack, which Dönitz actually uses the phrase in English in an interview that you can find online. But that was, seems to me, as it kind of got re-imported from English into German. They called it pack tactics, but the idea was the same. What the Wolfpack was, this was an idea that Dönitz came up with during the interwar years as a way to defeat convoys. It was the implementation of a convoy system in 1917 that stopped the Germans' almost successful U-boat campaign in World War I. And Dönitz spent much of the interwar years thinking about how can we defeat convoys in the next war. And what he realized is that if you attack with multiple U-boats by surprise from multiple directions, hit fast, hit hard, get in close, sink ships, and then bug out, you can basically you can overwhelm the escorts and rip a convoy to pieces. The Wolfpack was used extensively, especially between 1941 and 1943 in the North Central Atlantic, but it was not used along the East Coast for a couple of reasons. One being that it was too far out on the U-boat's operational leash in terms of range for it to really be practical. Also, there were no convoys along the East Coast for the first 5 months because a guy named Ernest King did not want to do his job. Third and final topic, I want to talk a little bit about some of the technical aspects of the U-boat war. And really, again, we're focusing on the U-boat war in the first half of 1942. And if you're talking about the first half of 1942 U-boats, you're talking mostly about the Western Hemisphere and US waters. So all of this stuff applies to the subject matter of the book. This is a custom artwork piece I had commissioned by a very talented artist down in Delaware named Bob Pratt. If anyone has read Ed Offley's, he wrote 2 U-boat books. Mr. Pratt also did the maps and the diagrams for those books as well. Bob did this diagram, and then he did the map that's in the front of the book. But this shows a Type 9 U-boat, an internal view, and then a Type 7 external view. For the sake of space, I wanted to make sure that I had both U-boat variants covered, but I couldn't show inside and outside for both, and they're very, very similar machines anyway. So I did internal for the Type 9 and external for the Type 7. The Type 9 and Type 7 and their multiple variants, the Type 9C, Type 9B, etc. These were the workhorse models of the U-boat. This was really the entire U-boat fleet, ocean going. Everything was either a Type 7 or a Type 9, some variant thereof. The Type 2s were basically coastal boats. They didn't see a lot of action after 1939. And it's really all the Type 7s and the Type 9s. They both operated along the US coast. The main difference is that the Type 9s were larger, so they could carry more fuel and therefore at a longer range, and they could carry more torpedoes. Some of the internal compartments were slightly different in terms of placement, but overall, these are basically the same boat with the exception of size. So the first thing that you see when you look at a U-boat is the outside shape. So what you're seeing is the external hull. That was what gave it a streamlined shape that's optimized for surface travel. As I kind of alluded to earlier, these were basically torpedo boats that could also submerge for limited periods. So the reason that what you see looks quite different from a modern submarine is that modern submarines are intended to operate primarily submerged. These were the other way around, and their external aesthetic, I think they look cooler, but their aesthetics are different accordingly. So I refer to the external hull and then the inner pressure hull, but really the Type 9 was a true double hull boat. The Type 7 was like a 1.5 hull. So some parts of it, there's only the pressure hull, but it functions in more or less the same way. So the outer hull was flexible. It was not pressure resistant and it was not watertight. So when the boat dived, water flooded into that gap between the two hulls. That helped prevent air pockets or bubbles that could interfere with diving. So the outer hull is just kind of an outer shell to give it a hydrodynamic form. The second one is the inner hull, or the pressure hull. This was the one that actually kept the crew alive and that enabled it to dive to significant depth. So this is, I think it was 20 millimeters thick. It's less than an inch thick, but it was welded steel. And for the Type 7s and Type 9s, they could enable it to dive down to a rated depth of 656 feet or 200 meters. In a pinch, they could go a little bit deeper than that. There are some boats went down as far as 900 feet and still came back, but the rated depth is 656 feet. The pressure hull also extended up into the tower, so that part of it was included, and it had 3 compartments plus the tower, so really 4 compartments that could be made watertight and pressure tight, but generally they were kept open. The U-boat was powered by diesel engines on the surface. These were a six-cylinder, 4-stroke diesel made by Germania-Werft, 6-cylinder for the Type 7, 9-cylinder for the Type 9. When they were submerged, they were powered by electric motors instead. These were usually made by Siemens. And the electric motors fed off these large banks of batteries located under the deck plates. These were about 50 tons. These were 110 volt DC lead acid dry cell batteries. Obviously submarine, the way it goes up and down, it has ballast tanks that can be flooded and drained. The configuration of the ballast tanks differs a little bit between the 2 variants, but what you're seeing above is what the Type 7's tanks look like. One of the differences between the Type 7 and the Type 9 is that the Type 7 had one of its ballast tanks inside the pressure hull, whereas all the Type 9s were between the 2 hulls. That made the Type 7, even though it was smaller, it was a little bit more rugged. Not really a decisive difference, though. You'll also notice that the Type 7 has these bulges from the saddle tanks on the side. This is how you can visually tell a Type 7 apart from a Type 9 just at a glance. If it's got those side bulges, it's a Type 7. Those are fuel ballast tanks. When they go out to sea, they're filled with fuel. And as the fuel gets depleted, it fills up with water from below. So by about halfway through the patrol, it just functions as a normal ballast tank. This is because the Type 7 was smaller, so this was to give it a little bit more range. The Type 9, like the U505 in Chicago, it doesn't have those bulges because it was designed to accommodate that fuel and ballast capability within the external hull. There was also a hydrophone mounted on the front. It was 24 receivers on either side of the forward hydroplanes. This fed to a device that was operated by a steering wheel actually in the sound room. And from here, one of the radio men could hear a significant distance through the water. This thing could hear a single ship at 12 kilometers and at 12 miles, and a convoy at 60 miles due to how sound moves through water. There were torpedo rooms at both the bow and stern. Unlike US subs, which had 6 forward tubes, the Type 7 and 9 both had 4. The Type 7 had 2 aft tubes, whereas the Type 9 had 2 aft tubes, whereas the smaller Type 7 just had 1. There's also a deck gun. These were mounted until about mid-1943 when they were removed from most boats. But these were useful for sinking a damaged ship without having to expend another torpedo. It was also in 1942, they both had a 20 millimeter fully auto gun on the Winter Garden, which is this platform aft of the bridge. And then the Type 9, being larger, also had a single shot 37 millimeter on the aft deck. Later in the war, the main guns, as I said, would be dropped and the anti-aircraft armament would be boosted and then pulled in toward the conning tower. That's why if you go to the U-995 where I was in June, or the U-505 out in Chicago, you'll notice they have these extra, there's an extra gun platform and more guns than this. But this was the 1942 configuration. So moving on, unlike a lot of you guys, I not only did not get into the Naval Academy, they didn't even let me into the summer seminar because my math grades were so bad, which in hindsight, I'm actually pretty grateful for. It was better for everyone in the long run. But as a result, I never had any of the naval science classes that I would have gotten. So this stuff on here, I had to teach myself. I'm not going to teach you guys here. I don't even think I could at this point. But obviously, we know that there's a relative motion problem when a moving object is going to hit a moving object with a third moving object. So obviously, we are trying to solve for that angle beta right there. I had to teach myself this. It took me forever, but I did. And obviously, if you were firing more than a single torpedo, as often happened, you have to also be able to calculate the spread angle between those separate eels. So back in World War I, the submarine commander would actually have to do this with a slide rule, and he'd have to be really good at math. It was a little bit easier by World War II because most of the world's navies, or at least all the ones that mattered, had deployed analog calculators that could figure this stuff out. So here's an overview of how it worked on a U-boat. So there's obviously a bunch of data inputs that need to be used in order to come up with a firing solution. So one of those data inputs is the bearing between myself, if I'm the commander or the torpedo officer, the bearing from myself to the target. So if you're on the surface, there's a device called the UZO, Unterwasserzieloptik. This is basically a big binocular setup on the bridge that would feed that directly to the calculator. If you were submerged and it was the commander running the show, the periscope worked the same way. So there's one variable. There's the bearing from me to my target. So that gets transmitted automatically to the calculator. In German, it was called the Torpedo Vorhaltrechner, TVRE. The American US Navy would just call it a TDC, Torpedo Data Computer. But this is down below the bridge inside the conning tower. It would actually be just to the right of the periscope, of the attack periscope. So that bearing the target gets transmitted automatically. The other inputs do require some skill to figure out. So that's the speed the enemy's moving at, the speed the target's moving at, the bearing of the target, the angle on the bow or target angle. So the commander and or first watch officer still have to figure that out by mental math. So one input gets transmitted to that calculator. The other one get reported verbally. The petty officer at the computer plugs in the dials. The TVRE was better than the British version, but not quite as good as the American TDC. This was another Siemens product. It's just an electromagnetic analog calculator. So the petty officer turns the dials accordingly, put to hand jam in the inputs. It gets the other input directly, and it gets a second input from the boat's gyro compass. So the TVRE will calculate the firing solution, and when it does, it sends it automatically to the torpedo tube. Actually, it routes it through that device you see up on the overhead there. But the actual heading that the torpedo is going to move at, that gets automatically entered into the torpedo by that spindle that's down there in the bottom left. So nothing needs to get done. Once it gets calculated, it gets programmed immediately into the weapon. The other stuff, however, the running depth and the speed, torpedo speed, if it's a combustion torpedo, those get entered in manually by hand. There's some knobs and levers roughly within that red box. I took this picture on the left in Germany in June. So the heading gets programmed in there automatically. The other stuff gets done by hand. But this means that a lot of math can get done very quickly. And the computer could even automatically update as if you get your target lined up and your variables correct, but then keep moving, the computer you can set it to continue to do the math. The only caveat being if the target changes course or speed, then you have to refine it. but it's pretty impressive what all this can be done with no digitization. As I said, better than the British one, but apparently it was not quite as fancy as the Americans. And then, of course, we have the teeth of the U-boat fleet, the G7 torpedo. This was the base model of torpedo that was used throughout the war. I did not realize another thing I didn't know going into this is how big these things are. I was thinking, like, what's the torpedo? 8, 9 feet? No, these are more than 23 feet long and about 3,400 pounds, depending on if it's combustion or electric. They're huge. And it must be frustrating when they would fire a fan of 4 and they would all miss. Like, that's an enormous amount of hardware that goes to waste. But in 1942, there were 2 versions that were used. It was either the G7A or G7E. One was an air-fed combustion engine. The other one was electric. The main difference between the two, the electric one required more maintenance, but it left no trail of bubbles behind it, which if you're, say, targeting a destroyer, like what happens in Chapter 8 with the USS Jacob Jones, you obviously don't want to be using a weapon that points back in your direction. The warhead was 617 pounds of hexanite, which is a TNT-based explosive boosted with powdered aluminum. Nothing particularly remarkable there, but it certainly packed enough punch. There were impact and magnetic detonators. I don't have the time to talk about the torpedo crisis here, but most of you will probably be familiar with the fact that the U.S. Navy had serious problems with its torpedoes in World War II. Well, so did the German Kriegsmarine. They were slightly different problems, but long story short, because of these issues, the Germans were not able to use their magnetic detonators along the East Coast. They could only use impact detonators. The gyroscope and depth control, I like to wow non-military audiences with explaining that, but I think most of you guys are probably pretty familiar, or at least wouldn't be suppressed or impressed or surprised. Later in the war, there were pattern running torpedoes that could be fired into a convoy, and then it would just run a certain pattern until it hopefully hit something. They also developed homing torpedoes that could follow the sound of a destroyer's screws. They were intended as anti-destroyer weapons, so they were major retailers will have it online. I've been told it's at some Barnes and Noble's brick and mortar shops in New Jersey, but I haven't checked myself. But it's on Amazon. You can get it on Barnes and Noble. Kindle version, hardcover, and as I said, the audiobook will be out on the 20th. And I haven't been given any preview of the audiobook or anything, but they picked a really good narrator. They asked me if I wanted to narrate, and I turned it down. But I didn't want to mess it up, frankly. But I listened to a lot of audiobooks, and the guy that they picked, David Stifel, I've listened to some of his stuff before, and he's really good. So I'm very, very glad that it's in good hands, or vocal cords, whatever it is. So we'll go to questions and answer now with however much time we have left. If you do want to contact me, hit me up on X or Twitter or wherever we're calling it, Instagram, and there's a portal on my website. It goes right to my email. So that's all I got.
Hey, thanks, Kay. That was a very informative, and Fox, there were some really good comments in there. You might want to pull that up, and if there's something.
I'm not sure if I can see that. I think because I'm in screen share. Should you want me to take it off screen share?
Yeah, I think it's a good idea. We had a couple of hiccups. A couple of folks said that they lost video, and then it popped back up. So I don't know what that was all about, but hopefully everybody had most folks caught most of the presentation, because your graphics are really spot on as far as those two.
Oh, thank you. That's just trial and error on my part, figuring out what works.
And
all right, let me try to find the chat. There we go.
Yeah.
No, all right. What illustrations were lost?
There was a couple of folks who said that they lost the illustrations as you were going through the submarine. So I don't, but it was just 1 or 2. So I don't know what the extent was, if it was on their end or because I had it the whole time. So
okay.
So anyway,
all right. Can you guys still see me? I'm sorry, I'm not familiar with the Zoom layout. There we go. Okay.
I got you. So, um,
All right.
let me all go ahead. What got, well, first of all, what got you interested in doing this book?
Oh, so it was really a convergence of interests. So as you could figure out if you look at my social media, I'm a war nerd, right? I've been a history guy and a war history guy for as long as I can remember being anything. I from some of my earliest memories are asking my grandfather about his war experience. So this general domain has always been my thing. Unfortunately, I haven't figured out a way to make a living from it yet, so it's a side hustle for now. But so I'm a history guy, and I'm more accurately like a human conflict guy, specifically like or especially turn of the 20th century to the present. So I love naval history, but my naval history interests are especially like 1900 to World War II. Not and nearly as interested about after or before, but so that's first thing. Always been a history guy. Always been a war history aficionado. But really, what put the thought in my head was diving and being able to dive. I said that each of the 11 chapters in part two is centered on a different ship that was sunk off the Jersey Shore. I've been lucky enough to dive a few of those, and I dove them a few years before I started this book. And as like I mentioned in the prologue, that's kind of what got my wheels first turning. Is I realized how much history is out there and that just is essentially forgotten about. Because for of those 11 ships, only one of them has ever been written about in any long form with any long form serious scholarship. The other 10 are just, you can't find more than a couple of paragraphs for the most part. Maybe it's mentioned in a book, but there's nothing out there. So I wanted to tell the definitive story of these ships. And I got to talk about, ships exploding and weaponry and all that stuff. And that's where I live. So hope that answered it.
Yeah, from our tuned audience with comments, any follow-ups to some of the observations?
Yes.
I'm sorry.
Trip.
Hello, Trip.
Hi. In Newport, we're immersed with that because, of course, the Newport torpedo station was here. And I just came over the Newport Bridge a little while ago and looked to the north end of Gould Island, where the firing platform was, and the string of buoys headed out to the north. So they had a firing range close by. And just to share with all of you that we have annual international officers who arrive at the War College in July. Every November, the German officer conducts a Volkstrauertag, a People's Memorial Day service at the grave of ein unbekannter deutscher Seaman, an unknown German sailor, the one sailor who was brought up from the U-853 that was sunk on 5 May 1945, just east of Block Island. And I'll repeat that. 3 days before VE Day, a German submarine sinks the oiler Black Point a few miles east of Block Island and is sunk after about 600 projectiles are dropped on it. That's a combination of depth charges and hedgehogs. So imagine 3 days before VE Day and right off the Atlantic coast, there's still one final action. So we're with that always, and the German officer is very mindful of this. It's an incredible ceremony because in that ceremony, he announces to the assembled group, which is made up of a lot of his international classmates, that Germany at the Volkstrauertag takes responsibility for the millions of deaths caused globally by German aggression. The Volkstrauertag is not a weekend for sales at the malls or barbecues. It's for the German people to accept the responsibility for what they did in the world. So we've got some really interesting things happening here in Newport out here.
Cool. Thank you very much for sharing. The U-853 story is indeed a crazy one. It was such an amazing story. I had to include a big section of chapter 16 about it, even though it's not a New Jersey event. There's plenty of stuff in this book that was not necessarily New Jersey, but a couple of people questioned, like, you spent 2 pages on U-853. Well, as the gentleman just said, it's a pretty dramatic story. I couldn't not include it, and it's still full of bones today. In fact, a few people have taken them out over the years, which is pretty about as bad a thing as you can do. But yeah, it's right there. Thank you very much.
You're very welcome. As a matter of fact, if you go to the Naval War College Museum up on the 2nd floor, they have the commemoration of the visit of the U-53 during World War I when the U.S. was still neutral. And then they have the exhibit on the U-853, including the ship's roster and the name of the captain, who either did not get the signal from Dönitz to return, or he decided to continue the war on his own.
I think it was the latter, because there's evidence that he did. There's evidence he did get the transmission. There's circumstantial evidence. So I think most likely he thought it was a ruse. I think he couldn't or didn't want to believe it. I don't think it was stubbornness, but anyway, we'll never know. But thank you very much, sir.
Thank you.
All right.
Another question?
Yes. Yes, sir. I'll get to the ones in the chat as well.
The torpedoes that you spoke of toward the end of the lecture, what was the running speed of those torpedoes? As in, what would be the chances of a destroyer outrunning a pursuing torpedo?
Sure. So outrunning, no. Dodging, yeah, if you could see it in enough time. So on the electric one, we're talking, and again, my memory is a little scrambled because the book I use mostly imperial units, because I wrote this for like a general readership. So I listed like torpedo speed in miles per hour, which normally it would be either knots or kilometers per hour. But electric torpedo, they only had one speed, and that was about 36 miles an hour. And then the G7A, that had 3 speeds. I want to say the fastest was 40 miles an hour, down to, if you wanted longer range, you could turn it down lower. But they could be dodged if they were seen. The problem was it was very hard to see an electric torpedo. You still could. The air torpedo would leave that stream of bubbles. But if it's at night and it's dark, you might not see that either. But if you see it in time, you can dodge it. And one of the many things that makes naval warfare so fascinating to read about, like one of the many, many little details of some of these engagements is, I use the example at Midway where there were aircraft carriers swerving, dodging a dozen torpedoes at a lick. Ships could do this, but they have to be seen in advance. So lots of ships saw these. Usually merchant ships couldn't get out of the way fast enough. It would usually, it was rare for them to swerve one. Hope that answered the question.
Thank you.
All right, I want to get to some of these in the chat too, so they don't get overlooked. Gary Schnurbush, am I saying that right? When did the Allies begin convoying in earnest? So, Gary, you still on the line with us? So the convoys in the north.
Yeah, I am. Sorry.
So the convoys on the North Atlantic, those began almost as soon as the war did. The convoys along the East Coast did not start until mid-May of 1942. And that was what killed us, that 4 months and change gap where Admiral King refused to implement a convoy system, even though he had the resources to do so. There's a lot of blood. There was a lot of blood spilled because of that decision, among others. Sorry, I skimmed the rest of this here. Yeah, the Brits were very good at the surface the anti-submarine warfare stuff. In fact, they told us everything they knew prior to 1942, and a certain admiral didn't want to hear any of it. You guys picking up on a theme here? Yeah, Greyhound is a great action flick, and it actually is it's more realistic than you might think, even though it's still Hollywood. It got a few things surprisingly right. Most of it didn't, but it's a great action flick either way. Any other questions? I got as long as you guys got. Bob?
No, one
I
of
forgot we have hand icons.
yeah, we do have. It's kind of interesting. Here, I live down by Mount Vernon, and around the corner, passed away a few years ago, was Phil Lundeberg, who was one of Morrison's.
Oh yeah,
and
yeah.
He was on one of the last destroyer escort that was sunk by a U-boat, and
Yep. Something Davis.
yeah, Frederick K.
Something
Davis.
C. Davis.
Yeah,
Frederick. Yeah, Frederick C. Yeah.
Frederick C. Davis. And the interesting thing is that the U-boat, they captured the U-boat. Well, not that U-boat, but the crew. They sunk the U-boat. And Fort Hunt, which is just down the block here, was a POW camp for German U-boat sailors. So there's kind of like a direct connection here with the war down here in Mount Vernon at Fort Hunt. So.
Yeah, Phil Lundeberg. I got excited because I found his work really late in my research, and he didn't write a ton, but what he did write was really good, and he wrote an excellent kind of analysis of what happened to those POWs. It's a very interesting, complicated story, but it involves Marines bludgeoning this commandant with nightsticks because I won't spoil the surprise, but that's another great fodder for a book. Bob Thompson.
Yeah. First of all, I have to compliment you as a submariner. I think you've done an exceptional job, especially as a Marine.
Thank you, sir.
In explaining the operation of submarines.
Thank you.
And what we have to deal with. You also did a very good job of explaining how there was a book written by Arthur Herman called Freedom's Forge. And if people here haven't read it, I highly recommend it. It is a remarkable description. I'm sure you've read it already, but
it's in my Amazon list. Actually, I haven't read it though.
It is spectacular. If you want to think about America and what we can accomplish and how we can accomplish, even in times of, because it wasn't like everybody was on board this initially.
Yeah.
And the guy behind it, Knudsen, was not even college educated. So remarkable. Anyway, that was great. You did a great job of that. The other thing that became very evident here is listening to your description about the problems that they had with their torpedoes, which I was not aware of.
Oh yeah.
The how much the personalities of admirals can affect war and affect the people. Your comment about Ernest King was very interesting about not willing to do it. And I always think back to Nimitz's battle with the bureaucracy to try and fix the torpedoes, which I think were fixed in Newport. That somebody
late 43, I think.
God, what a fight! I mean, they wouldn't believe the captains when they came back. It was remarkable.
Oh, you're missing. Your aim's bad.
Oh yeah, it was really something. Anyway, great presentation. Kudos for your descriptions. Thank you.
Thank you. It means a lot to me.
Michael
Dodd.
Yes, hi. Thank you for your presentation. Very interesting.
Thank you,
I had
sir.
a question about one of your first slides. You talked about 210 ships were sunk between January 42 and August 42. Was they U.S. ships or ships around of any nationality?
That's ships neutral and allied within 400 nautical miles of a U.S. beach.
And that's between
US coast.
January 42 and August 42.
Yes, and here's something to consider. So that 210 figure, which is spot on. I even got the grid coordinates for all those ships and plotted them out on Google Earth. that figure and that death toll, I meant to mention this earlier, so thank you for reminding me. That is only what I plotted within 400 nautical miles of a US coast. That is not including Canadian figures, and it's not including Caribbean figures. So if you include that, the total numbers for the Western Hemisphere double in terms of ships and lives.
Yeah, I had read
Double.
that it was over 400 ships actually, but maybe it
That's
depends on
hemisphere.
Yeah.
And that's exactly what I was talking about when I said I kept finding these kind of round figures, and I said, 400 something, that sounds like broadly correct for, you know, the region. But yeah, that was basically the Western Hemisphere for 420 something.
And that was 29% of the U.S. Merchant Marine. Is that what you said?
That was, without pulling the slide up again, that was, I think, 29% of all merchant ships by number of ships sunk
Not just
worldwide.
US.
Correct, not just US.
Okay.
This is, I'm lumping all
It was a
together.
bigger
And,
percentage. I think it was a bigger percentage of U.S. ships actually. It was astonishing.
at that, yeah, I can, because I told you about, I mentioned that Excel sheet that I built. I could look that up, you know, if you gave me 3 minutes. But yeah,
No.
it was. No, I'm not going to, but I'm just saying. Call it a third to maybe a half U.S. ships, U.S. flagged, maybe a third.
That's astonishing in the first 6 months of the war. It's just incredible. And somebody said Admiral King was a big problem there. The Navy was caught with their pants down.
Yeah. Sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to finalize by saying I have someone recommended, Mr. Thompson recommended a good book. And there's also an excellent book called Arsenal of Democracy. I don't know if you've read that or not. That's more about aircraft production.
No.
And the other fascinating book is called The Mysterious Case of Rudolph Diesel. Has anybody read that? That is, of course, he's the inventor of the diesel.
Vaguely familiar. It
It's
sounds
only been
familiar. I know.
It's been out a few months, and it's a fascinating story about how he developed, obviously, the diesel engine. The mysterious. It's just I think the group might be interested in that book. So thank you again for your presentation.
Thank you, thank you for the recommendation, sir. I really appreciate that. Michael Dodd, or no, you're Michael Dodd.
Sure.
I saw the hand up. Let me real quick make sure. I think Gary had a few more in the chat here.
Most of them are all observations, I think.
Okay, got it. Trip.
Yes, thank you. Two quick ones. First one, another great sub movie dealing with the torpedo problems is named Operation Pacific. Yes, it does have John Wayne, but it really covers a lot of the things, at least for the viewing public. Second thing is, you mentioned the TDRE versus the TDC, and that the TDC was, the American version
I'm
was
told it's better, yeah.
a little better. I'm curious, has anyone ever sat down with the two machines side by side to see what science was involved, or what engineering was involved?
I haven't heard that. My expertise, such as it is just on the TVRE. I'm not sure if anyone has. I don't know. It's a great question, and if it hasn't been done, it probably should be, because I would like to know.
Yeah, it'd be interesting to see. It'd be interesting to see how the Germans arrived at their targeting, and see if they are on the same track as the U.S. or if it was two completely different methodologies.
Yeah, I do know there were some other fire control differences as far as the actual gears and cams. I'm not sure, but it's a good question. Bob, do you have something?
Well, the math is the same, Trip. And
yeah. Hey, math is not my thing. We already established this.
But I suspect when
I've never passed a math class in my life, so
you just keep writing. You're doing fine.
I found my niche. Yeah.
When I suspect when they pulled in U-505, the one you can see in Chicago. I suspect they were all over that thing, trying to figure out what the hell they were doing. So it wouldn't surprise me at the time. I don't know if it was ever documented, but I have to think that somebody was looking hard at it.
So I have, and it's not like secret info. It's a friend of mine runs a great website called uboatarchive.net. Go check it out. He's got tons and tons of primary source documents that he finds, scans, catalogs, and uploads. So he's got all the U-505 intelligence reports.
Yeah.
He's got countless. I mean, that's where I got all the logbooks for every U-boat. in my main story. He's actually he's a retired U.S. Navy pilot. He was, I think, a P3 guy, but he lives up in Canada now. But Jerry Mason's his name. In fact, he'd be a great guest to come on. I don't know if he does this kind of thing, but he's super knowledgeable. He's even above my level when it comes to the nuts and bolts of this stuff. But I read that some of that primary source stuff, like the interrogations, is so interesting, including the U-505 and then the first U-boat they captured, which was the U-570 in 1941. So they took that thing apart down to the bolts, and the U.S. was still neutral at the time. They brought over the U.S. Navy, and they did their own report on it. So I extensively relied on that technical documentation in order to recreate it in the book.
What was the name
Lots
of
of good stuff.
I've never heard of this for the previous submarine. What was that one?
Yep. U-570.
Interesting. The other thing,
And it was recommissioned as the HMS Graf the remainder of the war. They also got U-110, but they got the Enigma machine out of it, and then it sank under tow. So they didn't actually keep that one, but they bagged 2 in 41.
they had the other thing was that, you know, the big thing that they perfected was snorkel, but that wasn't until late in the war, I believe, and they actually got that from the Dutch, I think. So
Yep.
not available to them off the east coast of New Jersey.
Correct. They didn't need it at the time. They could still do it the old-fashioned way. The problem is that within a year of the events of my story, and you know, this early first half of 1942, within a year they can't operate like that anymore. So the real heyday of the U-boat Waffe was 1941 to late 42, early 41 to late 42.
Had they not? I remember there was a period of time, at least I read, this period of time where they were not blacking out the shore, and so the ships were silhouetted out, so it was easy to pick them off.
Yep. That was a policy failure. It was a real one. And it was actually blamed on civilians after the war, when in reality, once again, it was a military failure. It wasn't solely King, but King was probably the biggest one that dropped the ball. So that was true, although it wasn't as big a tactical advantage as it's been thought to be. So yes, the coast was not blacked out during the worst months. Yes, it would have been a little bit less awful if it was, but it wasn't like a game changer. It still would have been bad. What would have made this period that I write about really bad, and I figured this out from crunching the numbers, is if they had a working magnetic detonator. So what I did was, and I keep meaning to expand the scope of just the first wave of U-boats, how many hits, how many misses, and how many sinkings they got. And then I extrapolated that out. Okay, what if magnetic torpedoes, which are pretty much one-hit sinkings? If you hit it, it's going down. So I figured out that essentially the losses along the coast would have been double if the Germans had a working magnetic detonator, but they didn't. It only happens to the impact detonator. So we got off less bad than we could have been. So
did the Japanese.
Yeah, well, the Japanese were the only people that had their torpedo game on point.
Well,
that
the Japanese
Type 93.
Yeah, but
long lands.
The Japanese,
long lands.
Yeah.
The Japanese got off because ours didn't work either.
Yeah. Yep. Anything else?
I covered here from Alexandria, home of the torpedo factory that made some of those defective torpedoes. So I tell you what, let's close it out, and everybody who tuned in, I hope you're going to tune in January when we have David Conan, who's coming out with his biography of Admiral Ernest King. So
really?
It's going to be coming out by
really.
Yeah.
Because there's only one biography of him to date, and it's not pretty boring. It's not, and it's clearly.
It's a very, as David Conan will say, it's a very flawed biography. So he's going to set the record straight. And I think
in the interest of full transparency.
Yeah.
I was going to say, Dave, in the interest of transparency, my condemnations of King are based on my area, my folk. I know he was a brilliant guy that did good things with shipbuilding. All I'm saying is in this topic, he failed almost as hard as you could possibly fail. But, you know, in the interest of fairness.
We'll see. Yeah, we'll see what his take is coming out here shortly. And actually, Trent Hone is also working on a book on King to come out, I guess, about 2 to 3 years. So there's a lot more interest on King after a couple of decades. So which is good for naval history. Next month we have with the Naval Order having their annual Congress in October in Buffalo. We're going to have a talk on the Battle of Lake Erie. So stay tuned on the 2nd September of the second Wednesday of September. And I'm going to turn it over to Bob because I think Bob's going to have a presentation. You there, Bob? We still have, or did we lose our folks? I think we lost Bob. Oh, no, he's there.
Bob Thompson.
Bob Whitcup.
Oh, there you go.
No, I don't see him.
Yeah.
I see
He's
him
there.
on my screen.
Hey, Bob Whitcup.
Oh, there he is. Yeah.
Yeah, we want to close this out here. I think you typically present offer a membership to the Naval Order, don't you? And for some reason he is not. He's muted. And he's up there. So
Bob, hold down your space bar and talk.
He's muted. Oh, interesting. Okay.
Hey, Bob Whitcup, can you hear us? Bob Whitcup. I think he's muted and he can't hear us.
Yeah. No. Okay. Anyway, what I'll do is we'll close it out and we'll put Bob in touch with K.A. There he is.
My sound is back. I'm K.A. Thank you again. I really appreciate the wonderfully presented discussion. And I think they probably offered you a complimentary year membership in the Naval Order, and hoping you'll renew that afterwards. But
Awesome.
since you're there in Westchester, Pennsylvania, we'll put you directly in touch with Philadelphia, Delaware Valley. And the other part of that is we're going to Philadelphia next year. We're going to Buffalo this year for our Congress, but we're going to Philadelphia next year. So please stay in touch with us as a possible presenter for Congress next year. But again, thank you very much from the Naval Order for doing this.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
Dave, that's all I got.
Okay, so I think you can close us out.
Okay,
Thanks everyone.
Take care.